people like Heidi McDonald, Rich Johnson, David Harper have been championing and begging DC and Marvel to drive the fucking Titanic into the iceberg just to see what happens because, hey, this is the new audience that we're looking for. Turns out there is no new audience looking for LGBTQ, slice of life, coming of age stories with fucking superheroes. Shocker on that one. It only took the Shill media about 6 years to catch up with the fact that things are not all right within comic books. There are, in fact, a lot of problems out there, and they're finally willing to admit this stuff. And now, Heidi McDonald, Rich Johnson, and their ilk are actually going back and retroactively agreeing with me as well, because it just didn't start in 2023. This started years ago. Oh, really? That's news to me and the viewers on this channel. We've been talking about a lot of the issues for years on the channel, and it's absolutely insane, the hubris of some of these people to act like, oh yeah, we've acknowledged there's been problems all along. Of course, they won't talk about what the problems are. We can only discuss these things in vague generalities because to get to the heart of the matter and actually point out what is wrong would make me a homophobe, a racist, a thisist, a thatist, a alt-right Nazi, something like that. Isn't that normally the call down that you get when you actually point out pretty mundane, specific reasons why comic books are in the state that they are in 2023 and have been heading for this state for absolute years now? We've talked about this, basically since the beginning. Sure, comic books aren't dying at this very moment. Sure, Marvel and DC aren't losing money yet, but they are losing readers at a pretty good clip, and they're having to do all these things to mask the losses. The variant cover schemes, the relaunches, and all this stuff. And we've talked specifically about how they need to do more and more events just to cover up for the fact that a lot of their longtime readers decided to exit because the stories weren't very good anymore, and we were called all kinds of bad names. But now that Heidi's on board, I guess perhaps the comic book industry has permission to fix itself now. She states, no matter what people have been telling you, periodical comic sales weren't dying during the pandemic. They were definitely declining before the pandemic, but not crashing cataclysmically. But that was then, and this is 2023, a time when inflation, economic uncertainty, and companies that cut thousands of jobs just so they can have made discretionary spending a lot harder. Rising rents have squeezed out not just independent stores, but large retail chains. It's a mess out there. Yeah, absolutely. And we've been heading for this mess. Well, certainly in Marvel's case for like 8 years now. And in DC's case, they decided to catch up over the last 4 or 5 years. This has all been happening. What's the famous quote? How did you go broke? Real slow and then all at once. There was going to be a time where the comic book industry reached critical mass to where you couldn't actually have any more crap piled on top of it before it started to implode or collapse it on itself. This has been a decline of 1,000 cuts on the comic book industry, specifically DC and Marvel, by bad decision making, in a lot of cases championed by the shill media like the Heidi McDonalds and your Rich Johnsons and your other morons out there that wanted to tell us for the last 4 years, there's nothing wrong here, everything is fine. But now we're retroactively going to go back and say, oh yes, actually sales were declining. There were actual indications that there were a problem. This is what she has to say about sales now. So what do we know about 2023 comic sales? They are definitely down, and estimates seem to hover around 20% at the ICV2 white paper in October. Milton Greep listed some sales data for 2023 year-to-date graphic novel sales and book channels down 19% in units per Circana book scan. Manga and book channel down 27%. 2023 year-to-date graphic novel dollar sales in comic stores down 7%. 2023 year-to-date comic sales down 7%. As you can see from the above, sales slipped even more in bookstores and in comic shops, but we hear about distressed comic shops a lot more, especially in the fourth quarter, because bookstores are big corporations for the most part, the big movers in bookstores, and they're not little mom and pop shops run by comic book fans that are trying to keep the comic book industry alive. And this idea, sales in bookstores are down even more in comic book shops. How do you know that? No one actually knows what the sales climate is in comic book shops now other than the individual comic book retailers themselves. There's no place that actually has hard and fast, true sales data when it comes to the direct market. We haven't had this data for about three and a half years, since the beginning of the pandemic shutdown, when Diamond decided to retroactively just shut the entire industry down. DC said, nah, we're not going to do that. Let's create Looter and another competitor. And then basically Diamond lost their monopoly on comic book sales, and we haven't had reliable sales data since then. And even then, Marvel were fidgeting and messing with the sales data, even before that, to make it look like their books were doing better than they were. There are no true sales data. We don't know exactly across the board what the sales decline is when it comes to the direct market. We know what people tell us. We know what it is when it comes to Coliseum of Comics, because that information is now public because Phil Boyle made it public. Otherwise, it's all guesses, and it's all guesses based on statistical modeling, which is a science. Statistical modeling is reliable for a period of time because the model itself is based on real data. The last time we knew actual sales across the industry, and then we had a small sample size that we also knew actual sales, and they were able to model the full sales based on that and test it against real data. We are over 3 years away from that. There are no reliable sales when it comes to the entire direct market itself. You cannot say it's only down 7%. Hell, you could say it raised 50%, and I couldn't definitively say you're relying other than people saying that's not what's happening in our store. Is the 7% number accurate? Probably not, because every minute you get away from when that model was created off of real data is a minute that it becomes less reliable. And now we're days, weeks, months, and years away from that. We're over 3 years past the time when we actually had real sales data to model that after for the Comics Hub people that are using that app or whatever. John Jackson Miller of Comicron.com will no longer put his name on those sales numbers because they are so unreliable. So that proves nothing. That absolutely means nothing. We don't know definitively that sales in the direct market aren't suffering like they are in the book channels. There's no actual data or proof to even suggest that number. But of course, Heidi is not the most honest broker out there when it comes to comic book numbers and sales data. In fact, Heidi's been telling us we're wrong the entire time, and we're just a bunch of bad people that want the industry to die. Au contraire, mon frere, I want the industry to live, and that's why I've been pointing out all these mistakes for 6 years now that you've been ignoring the entire time. She states to try to summarize the underlying issue, however, it does seem to be one of quality, or at least excitement. I will recall going to my first comic book shop, Quality Comics in Somerville, New Jersey, and eagerly tearing Howard the Duck from the bag and reading it in the car while my grandma was in Food Town. I don't know if anything gets me that excited now, and that creates the same kind of circular argument that seems to underlie many of these discussions. We need great content, but the creators of that content we once enjoyed don't move the needle as much anymore. And then she had like an example of even before the pandemic, Claremont and Byrne sales weren't as good as they were before. It's like, fucking John Byrne hasn't written an ongoing like X-Men book in 30 years. When's the last time Claremont did? Was it like 10 years ago? Probably longer than that. What the fuck are you talking about? You know, when the last time people got excited and they couldn't even make it home before they ripped their comic book open? It wasn't that long ago. House of X, Powers of 10. I saw it here on the channel. I saw it, in the comic book review sites. Everybody had to review those books because everyone was excited. You can get people in their 40s and 50s excited for comic books. It ain't that hard. There is an enormous quality issue, but we're not even allowed to discuss what the quality issue is. We're only allowed to acknowledge that the quality isn't there. Even though we know for a fact that all the sexuality changes, the race swaps, the gender changes of all these characters during the Marvel Now era was an enormous flop. We heard that. Marvel's own director of marketing, he said that directly and was vilified for it. Look what happened to Glenn from Comic Book Palace. Stated there are more writers out there that would like to write stories about themselves and the heroes. He was vilified for it because you're not allowed to talk about the real issues in comic books. There are a ton of quality issues, and it's not one thing. It's not just SJW this or politics in the comic books that. There are just bad writers basically across the board because DC and Marvel became so untenable and the rate sucked so bad that it wasn't worth it anymore. All the good writers basically left because they had the opportunity to go out there and make a name for themselves, and they didn't need Batman and X-Men anymore. They realized after seeing the success of crowdfunded comic books and other self-publishing ideas out there that you didn't need these guys anymore. It wasn't worth the hassle because their editorial staffs are basically garbage. Now, do I believe DC Comics wanted to fire over half their editorial staff because of layoffs at Warner Brothers before the Discovery thing? What was it at the time? It was AT&T, I believe. I think they are the ones that had Warner Brothers, right? And pieced it off to Discovery or whatever. When they fired all their editors, I don't think DC were looking for that to happen, but they never went out there and hired competent editors to replace them. They just had a bunch of people that didn't know anything decide they were going to dictate the future of comic books. And guess what? They drove it into the ground, which had already happened at Marvel Comics. Terrible editorial plus terrible writers plus terrible artists equals terrible comic books. This ain't exactly math science here. It's pretty easy to go 1 + 1 = 2 and decide what the outcome was going to be, which we've been talking about for years now. But we can't say, yeah, taking established characters, that have been around for 80 years and making them gay, that's a bad idea. We can't say replacing your entire lineup of Avengers out of the most popular heroes in the world all at the same time and swapping them out with like diversity characters was a bad idea. We can't admit that stuff. We can't say it was a bad idea to just stick Tom King on Batman and not make him write Batman stories and let him write stories about his own miserable life. Yeah, those ideas and that bad quality had nothing to do with any of this stuff. It's been a death by 1,000 paper cuts, as the guy from Graham Crackers had stated. Now, this, I guess, was the big turning moment, the big epiphany for Heidi McDonald. David Harper also made a very insightful point. A lot of the sales trends we were seeing in 2019 were headed for trouble, and the pandemic sales surge just masked those. As we enter 2024, we're seeing the results of variant covers, miniseries, and a lack of star power coming home to roost. The biggest elephant in the room is definitely the quality of the comics. That's a huge topic, and one I'll have to address in a separate post because this one is getting long. Oh yeah, very insightful, David Harper. You're only 2 or 3, 4, 5, 6 years late to the party on that one. We've already pointed that out, and we already said, hey, all these variant cover schemes, these aren't going to work long term. You got to stop thinking short term and actually root these out, or you're actually going to drive people off, driving the prices up to where it's almost untenable at this point to be a collector. Maybe not the best idea in the world. Why are we doing so many miniseries? Why are we rebooting everything? We've only been talking about it for 6 years fucking straight, as if any of this is new news. But it's new news to Heidi, and she's finally willing to acknowledge there are problems with comic books, and it's a problem with quality. But you cannot, and you should not talk about what that problem with quality is, because you might get into some culture war stuff. You might end up being a homophobe or a racist or an alt-right Nazi if you actually go out there and dare to actually shine some real light on this stuff and have a serious discussion about why we got where we were. We don't need to be here. It wasn't a foregone conclusion, but people like Heidi McDonald, Rich Johnson, David Harper have been championing and begging DC and Marvel to drive the fucking Titanic into the iceberg just to see what happens because, hey, this is the new audience that we're looking for. Turns out there is no new audience looking for LGBTQ, slice of life, coming of age stories with fucking superheroes. Shocker on that one. Wow, man could figure that one out a long time ago and decided it actually has to be written for the audience that it's intended for. We've been receiving comic book stories featuring superheroes that have nothing heroic in them for far too long. Is it all the comic books? Absolutely not. But it certainly was enough of the comic books to drive us off a cliff in 2023, and hopefully we will be able to get out of this. But it will not be with the aid of the Heidi McDonalds and the Rich Johnsons. It's time for the kids to go sit at the kiddie table and for the adults to actually come to the room and start talking about what's going on here and having meaningful discussions. That's been the biggest problem. You were never even allowed to acknowledge any of this stuff was happening. And we still aren't allowed to be truthful about it and how we got here. Of course, I'm going to remain truthful. I cannot be shut up, and I won't be shut up. I'm going to keep highlighting a lot of the issues going on with Marvel and DC and the entire comic book industry because that's what I do, baby. And I certainly do a lot more of that on the Patreon as well. If you are tired of dealing with this shit, if you want to stand up for the little guy and do something to be part of the solution, head over to my Patreon, consider supporting the channel, and we got a lot more great content there as well. There's a link in the video description.